Okay, good evening everybody, and welcome to the Fight Racism, Fight Imperialism LSE Student Society event. David Yaffe, who is on the editorial board of Fight Racism, Fight Imperialism, which is our fantastic newspaper, yeah? And he's been at LSE in 1968 as a student and was involved heavily and actively in the occupation of 1968, and tonight he is going to speak about the cuts and the capitalist crisis.
Well, I'd start by saying that the student response to the condemned government's plans to increase university tuition fees and abolish the education maintenance allowance has been fitting and inspiring. It struck a chord with millions of people who, if they're not already facing attacks from this government, are certainly going to face those attacks in a very significant way over the next year or so. And that's an important point. Secondly, I'd like to say what Fight Racism, Fight Imperialism's position on the question of tuition fees and so on actually is. And that's very, very simple. We are for free and universal education for all. We expect and argue that university education should be financed out of general taxation. Some have argued that this is unrealistic because we have to cut the deficit. Well, we say we are not responsible for the deficit, and therefore we don't accept any arguments that are related to the deficit being cut in this way. In total, planned spending cuts and tax rises of around £113 billion are planned, which is equivalent to £4,300 a year on average for every household in the country. And this will be imposed by 2014 and 15 as a result of the budget and spending review measures. And all this is taking place in a period of global crisis with increasing tensions between major countries threatening to turn into currency and trade wars. As we've argued in Fight Racism, Fight Imperialism throughout the crisis, these measures have a clear purpose to them. The government is utilising the deepest crisis since the Great Depression of the 1930s to continue with the class offensive that began in the 1980s. The debate over public spending is little more than a cover for the ruling class as it prepares a massive attack on the living standards of working people in this country in a brutal attempt to lay the foundation for resolving the crisis of British imperialism and sustain the City of London, the financial arm of British imperialism, as the dominant world financial centre. That's what lays behind the whole government policy relating to the deficit, the public sector deficit in this country. It is an attack on the working class by a government staffed by millionaires. 18 of the 23 full-time members of the cabinet are millionaires, as well as 23 out of 29 entitled to attend cabinet meetings, so I don't think they'll be too disturbed by the cuts. And they're acting essentially in the service of the City of London. It's a fact that the number of millionaires in this country has increased from 37,000 in Britain in 1997 to 448,000 by 2009. Most of it, oh well, all of it actually under a Labour government, something worth bearing in mind. In the third week of 2010, the then Labour Chancellor, Alistair Darling, told the Financial Times that he will order his ministers to start work on the most swinging cuts in public spending in a generation. Halving the public sector deficit in 4 years, he said, was non-negotiable. This was confirmed in his March budget. For the Labour Party, as for any ruling class party in power in this country, and this is a critical point, the interests of the international markets, the financial services sector, and the City of London are the unquestionable priorities. It should be no surprise that the Condemn coalition felt confident enough on coming to power to slash state welfare and public spending even further than the cuts that were planned by the Labour government. The City of London has always been at the heart of the British state. The crisis has strengthened this bond to a new level of intensity. The result of the crisis has therefore seen a further consolidation of finance capital and the state. That is, the further development of what has been called in the literature state monopoly capitalism or imperialism. The speculative activities of the financial corporations and the uncontrolled lending that fueled the unprecedented property booms in the main capitalist countries led to the biggest financial meltdown in history. The capitalist system survived this process because the state underwrote the debts of the banks and financial institutions on a scale never seen before. By 2009, the total support for the financial system from governments and central banks reached an unprecedented $14,000 billion in the UK, in the US, and the Eurozone, almost equivalent to a quarter of global GDP. I mean, quite staggering. So the debate about when and how much to cut public borrowing is an ideological diversion. At the end of 2008, more than a year into the present crisis, Britain's overseas assets reached a staggering £7,135 billion. £7,135 billion. An unprecedented 5 times Britain's GDP. Now we've heard that the assets of the banks in this country are about 5 times Britain's GDP, but we've never heard anything about the overseas assets of this country. No one talks about it. No one talks about these amazing figures. That the overseas assets of Britain are 5 times the GDP. In fact, they've redone those figures recently, and if I can find them, they do this all the time, but this time they're even more fantastic. They've added the financial derivatives. These are things that the banks do to make money out of nothing, or money out of money. Financial derivatives. They've added them, and they were a massive £4,040 billion. Financial derivatives of UK banks alone, £4,040 billion. This is just amazing. I mean, what is it, 2.5 times the GDP, something like that? And it took the foreign assets on these new figures of the UK to £10,980 billion. The GDP is about £1,400 billion, so that gives you some idea of what we're talking about. And that's nearly 7.5 times Britain's GDP. There's no other country in the world that gets anywhere near that. 60% of these assets, or 3 times Britain's GDP, are listed under other investments. That's very typical, actually. The largest part of Britain's foreign investments come under the category of other investment. They don't tell you what they are, but you can work it out. I mean, essentially, are loans and deposits abroad by UK banks, which we could call a gigantic usury capital. What do we mean by usury? We mean borrowing cheap and selling dear. Used to be against the major religions. Major religions used to be against each other. Not anymore. Usury is absolutely right at the centre of British capitalism. That's how it functions, as a giant usury capital, sort of an offshore centre for capital all over the world. And every single government in this country wants to keep it that way. The living standards of millions of people in Britain and around the world will be sacrificed to maintain Britain's global interests, the global role of the city, its banks, insurance companies, and other financial institutions. Over the next month or so, the banks will flaunt their enormous profits and hand out obscene bonuses to their top bankers. This is class war, brutally demonstrated by the recent statement of the Coalition Chancellor, multimillionaire George Osborne, that he would reduce the number of people who claim benefits as a lifetime choice. And he was not referring to the bankers. I mean, we've just started the process of trying to understand what is really happening. And I think it's really critically important. There's a lot of things, I certainly haven't said. When I say, we benefit in this country from the plunder and looting of the rest of the world, some people benefit more than others, right? And, if we talk about the trade unions not being fighting organisations of the class, when you realise that trade union leadership is, getting incomes of well over £100,000 a year. I mean, they are in a different ballgame, aren't they? And people don't easily give up that, just as the real ruling class doesn't give up its millions, and the kind of people in the cabinet. There were 10 of them, by the way, 10 millionaires in the Labour cabinet, and probably a lot more millionaires of ex-Labour cabinet members now. In terms of the jobs that they've given, or the rewards they've been given, for the dirty work in the interests of the banks and the multinational corporations. So there are big divisions in this country, and there will always be people that will try and tell you have to unify with the people who have not got the same interests as you. I mean, we're materialists. If you are earning £100,000 a year, it affects your existence, just as people who have large mortgages to pay, have a vested interest in the system, right, and certainly in holding on to their jobs. So, like in the teaching profession, there are going to be big divisions, right, because, they've split the teachers over the years in 1,000 different ways, and they make sure that, there's a whole layer that's doing very, very well, thank you very much, out of the system, and now they're paying head teachers, £100,000. And where's all this come from? In the last 5-10 years, maybe, or even less. And what they're doing is splitting us, right? They know what they're doing. They've been doing. British imperialism has been doing it for years and years and years, for centuries. Go to India, have a look. Why do we have India and Pakistan and Bangladesh? Right? Go to Ireland and see what has been done by the British, and they'll do it all the time. Divide and rule. It's obvious why they do it. They are a minority, and the minority can only rule by splitting the majority, and that's what it does all the time. And you have to put up with it. I was giving a talk in UCL last week, and I gave sort of broad outlines of. I was only allowed to speak for 10 minutes, and even then they tried to stop me. And I made some of these points, right? And suddenly somebody stands up and says, he says, that's the economics, but what about the fact that he supports Cuba, where they jail dissident workers? This is a guy from the left of this country, I think he was from Workers' Power or some workers, something or other, right? Standing up, and I didn't even mention Cuba in my whole contribution. What he refused to talk about was British imperialism. Because British imperialism is the foundation of his rather privileged life you know, as a student in University College London, right? You know, and the future privileged life that he can look forward to. And he was expressing that. He didn't know he was expressing that, but he was standing up and making these points in a totally gratuitous fashion, you know, with no evidence, nothing. I mean, I was going to point out, we've got a major article on the whole question of the changes in Cuba in the latest issue, but I thought I'm wasting my time. This man is not, you know, not open to discussion. But the fact that he could do that just shows, even at that level, there are divisions, and there will be people to ensuring that we don't unite, right, with the vast majority of the world that are fighting now, fighting imperialism now, in order to survive, right, all over the world, and they will try and prevent it. And, you know, they'll use Cuba, they'll use Chavez, they'll use anybody in order to prevent that unity. And that's why we really have to understand what we're about.